So this session is about bringing ground measurements and remote observations together. So that means in situ sensing, and it means satellite systems, and fusing data from those two different devices. And there's a lot of interesting challenges in that particular problem. And hopefully challenges associated with PowerPoint, or at least something I can master. So we have 3 invited speakers. We have Dmitry Kalashnikov here. He's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Merced. His main field is lightning and fires, and I think that's going to be a pretty interesting talk. And there's some really interesting remote sensing from satellites that involves lightning strikes. And I'm pretty interested to hear how that gets meshed with in situ sensing. Dr. Mallory Barnes is an associate professor at the University of Indiana Bloomington, and her specialty is climate.
Her specialty is nature-based climate solutions, thermal remote sensing. She does some drone work, and she focuses a lot of forests and carbon crediting.
Right. And then Dr. Shen Wang.
Dr. Shen Wang, she's a postdoctoral fellow at the same university who does a lot of stuff with satellite remote sensing and SIF data.
And my name is James Gallagher, and this is Cassandra Key, our fellow and clearly indispensable. So, and our other co-chair here is Joseph Bell, and he's from the USGS, and he's a water quality specialist, and he had some recorded comments. So I think if we click on a button or something, we can hear Joseph's voice from the great beyond.
Hello everyone, my name is Joseph Bell. On behalf of James Gallagher and Cassandra Key, I'd like to welcome you all to the EnviroSensing Cluster session, part of the ESIP Summer Meeting 2025. Our session today is a good one, and is focused on bridging the gap between in situ and remotely sensed observations. For those of you who do not know much about the EnviroSensing Cluster, the EnviroSensing Cluster is a community of science-driven practitioners working in various domains, including terrestrial in situ observations, long-term monitoring, my favorite, quality assurance, quality control, sensor engineering, field deployment and design, data networking, and software. Our members represent a diverse range of organizations, including citizen science groups, academia, private companies, and government agencies, NASA, NOAA, EPA, USGS, and others. We collaborate with, but we do not typically focus on, practices around remotely sensed data, for example, satellite imagery, drone surveys, aerial photography. This is what makes us think that today's session is really special, as in this session, we place a focus on harmonizing in situ and remotely sensed monitoring to serve cooperators' needs. We put together some key objectives for you all to keep in mind as the session goes on, and one of those key objectives is simplifying complex concepts, right? How to get data from the Earth and from space to work together. And then to demonstrate this, right? Demonstrate how this data is analyzed and utilized to address significant challenges in environmental monitoring. Is the data out there? How do we get this data? How do we use it to answer these questions, right? We want you to keep that in mind as we go through this session. One of the other things that we would like to do is start things off with an illustrated example, and then we'll hand things off to those back in the room. So if I can draw your attention to the picture of Ben Franklin up on the screen here, I can talk you through what this illustrative example is about, right? The image displays a blend of historical knowledge, Ben Franklin's experiment, with contemporary scientific practices, right? Satellites, drones, flying above. Benjamin Franklin's famous kite experiment during a thunderstorm, right? Here we're trying to show how it parallels our current efforts to index remotely sensed observations with ground truth data. In this analogy, Franklin provides ground truth for aircraft and satellites above by visually confirming lightning strikes at his observation point. The outcome of this Ben Franklin 2.0, if you will, is an indexed set of observations that spans from the surface of the Earth to space, and it's capable of correcting for interference along the way, for example, ionospheric effects, as well as potential drift, for example, an actual strike observed 1 mile from the satellite-derived position. This timing process enhances our ability to ground truth observations effectively, right? So we're showing here the importance of ground truthing, the importance of line of sight, visual observations from high above. Thank you all for joining us today. Enjoy the session. Turn it back to those in the room. Have a great ESIP Summer 2025 meeting.
So I think that's it for our slides, yeah?
No, that's it for, so it's up and down.
Oh, okay, yeah. So also, today, like all the sessions, we're using Slido for questions, and that helps make it so that the folks online can see what's being asked, and also we kind of get the most popular questions bubbled up, and it kind of puts everybody on the same footing there. And so that's our Slido information. And there's this extremely helpful URL that you can see down at the bottom here.
Some questions.
We do?
Yeah, also we will help our speakers.
All right. And overview, well, we've already sort of given you the overview. And so, yeah, so let's go.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Let's, everyone, if you can go to the Slido link and put in this code, we will put this link in the chat. It's also in the Google Docs that we have for the session. And we can do our interactive elements so we can bring together our in-person and our Zoom speakers. Sorry. Okay. Slido. This is how you do it. You just go to the Slido website and then we put in eco, M-O-N. And I'll give everyone a minute to get on the website. Sorry, we got about 3 questions.
Okay. Oh, right, that's right. That were just inserted.
Okay. So this is kind of a fun one that we like to do during conferences, is what country are you from? We got United States and China so far. Oh, it is cool. Russia. All right. So we got a few countries here, very interesting. Okay. Let's go to the next one. So for this one, we wanted to know, have you worked with ground truth sensors before? So these are like flux towers, soil sensors, etc. Anything on the ground. So for me, I work with eddy covariance data, so I will say yes. All right. Give this another minute. All right, so there's a lot of experience in this room, but there's some that aren't sure what a flux tower is. So a flux tower is basically a fancy weather station that can detect the atmospheric composition, or sorry, like the chemical atmosphere. Okay, basically it can sense like CO2, water vapor, that kind of stuff, temperature, soil water content, that kind of stuff, which we have through different platforms. Okay. Next up, let's see what your experience is with satellite observations and remote sensing. We'll start this one. I think if this works. Does it work? Okay. One sec. Sorry, this is chaos. Okay. This isn't working. Okay. Sorry, Slido is deciding to have problems and crashed. Okay, that's fine. Okay, let's do a raise of hands. How many people are familiar with satellite data? Okay, so does everyone know what a satellite is? I say that's a yes, okay. Does anyone, like, who uses it in their research? Okay, so there's a few. Okay, very cool. Sorry, first day sessions, things happen. It's okay. Okay, so now everyone's a little bit all over the board on this, which is good. That's why we're here, is to connect these different things. Okay, so we got Slido, and then we introduced our speakers. So first up, we're going to have Dmitry Kalashnikov, who's going to present his presentation on a multi-data set assessment of precipitation amounts associated with lightning-caused wildfire ignition across the western United States. And then after him, we will have our two Zoom speakers, Dr. Marley Barnes and Dr. Shen Wang, which we will introduce as they start their sessions. So Dmitry, if you can come on up, I will get your slides up. Also, thank you everyone for your patience with all the tech chaos, but it's working now, so it's all good.
There you go.
Take the floor, Dmitry.
And to advance, I'm guessing I just push the thing here.
You can
or
do like up and down.
up and down, that works. Okay, great. I'll just set my water here if you don't mind. Okay, hi everyone. I'm guessing we can all hear me. All right. Nice to be here. Thank you for the invite, Cassandra, to do this talk here. My name is Dmitry Kalashnikov, and I am at the University of California, Merced, but I actually live in Portland, Oregon, where I'm from. So I just drove up here. It's a 3-hour drive. I'm fortunate enough to do a remote postdoc there, so that's nice for me because I have a house, family in Portland, didn't want to move for 2 years. But yeah, the research that I'm presenting here today was actually done when I was a PhD student at WSU here in Washington. So more local research, I suppose. So yeah, I want to thank my collaborators listed here. Deepti Singh was my PhD advisor at WSU, and Jana Batsaglu is my current postdoc advisor at University of California, Merced. And yeah, so this work really was about trying to quantify how much rain actually falls or doesn't fall when lightning starts wildfires. And I want to move that Zoom widget out of the way if I can. You said right click here? Wait, more. And then, yes, perfect, thank you. Yeah, so quick show of hands. How many of you have heard of dry lightning as a concept? Okay, maybe half the room. Yeah, I've asked this question on the East Coast, and folks are not as familiar out there. Usually they have heavy rain with lightning out there. But yeah, here in the western US, we have this thing where lightning can happen, thunderstorms happen, and the rain actually evaporates, or mostly evaporates. And that's a real fire hazard, as you might imagine. Lightning ignites vegetation, which is then not extinguished. So I'll move on here. So yes, because of that, lightning is actually a major source of wildfire ignition in the western US. A little over 2/3 of all the western US burned area is actually due to lightning-caused fires. And we have exceptional years. For example, 2020 was a year when we had an extra amount of lightning-caused fires. There was a single 2-day outbreak of lightning, specifically dry lightning, in California in August of 2020, which set off numerous wildfires, which actually went on to burn a little over 2 million acres in that state over the next 2-3 months. So yes, lightning can be a huge source of wildfires in the western US. And again, there's that definition of dry lightning on the bottom. So typically, at least going back a few decades, dry lightning has been defined as any occurrence of cloud-to-ground lightning with less than 1/10 of an inch of rain. This is daily accumulated precipitation, so 2.5 millimeters or 1/10 of 1 inch of rain. Essentially, if less than that falls, it's not considered enough to prevent the landscape from igniting, right? It's just not enough to wet the landscape. But as you might imagine, there's probably some uncertainty and spatial variation in that precipitation amount. And in my lit reviews, as part of my PhD work, I found that it really wasn't well known and well quantified exactly how this threshold might vary across the West. So I wanted to tackle that and to try to hone in on how that number might actually vary. Oh.
Now they just like see your.
Oh.
So like push the screen on the.
Oh,
computer
on the
back,
computer.
just like a little bit.
Okay,
There you go. It's not better.
that's better?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Cool. Good to know. So yes, this takes me to my research goal, which is to develop this spatially variant definition of dry lightning across the western US, which goes beyond the traditional 2.5 millimeters to help forecast wildfire ignition risk and to inform climate model projections of future lightning-caused fires. So I did this analysis over a 6-year period from 2015 to 2020. The wildfire data is federal wildfire data from the National Interagency Fire Center. And because I wanted to essentially see how these precipitation amounts vary across the landscape, I needed some kind of sensible way to divide the western US beyond the sort of political boundaries which don't follow sort of ecology. So I picked these Bailey's eco-provinces, which are these big black polygons. They are regions of generally similar climate and vegetation composition, and because of that, they are also generally similar in their climate-fire relationships. For lightning, now there are satellite lightning data sets available, but they're shorter in terms of newer. They're just a lot newer. For example, the GOES lightning data only goes back to 2017, and I wanted something that was, for one, a little further back in time, because I only had data through 2020 for the other data sets for this, but also, more importantly, the GOES satellite data doesn't differentiate cloud to cloud or intra-cloud from the cloud to ground lightning. And as you might imagine, it's only the cloud to ground lightning which poses an actual risk of fire ignition. The lightning has to contact vegetation. And this National Lightning Detection Network, NLDN, actually they separate out the cloud to ground lightning strikes, which I need for this work. And this data set is actually very well established. They began in the 80s. Actually, back east, State University of New York at Albany was the original institution which started the NLDN, and throughout the 80s, they expanded westward. So by 1989, we had a national lightning detection network with ground sensors. There are these sort of like 3-foot-tall sensors that are spaced about every 250 kilometers or so across the country, and they do a pretty good job of sensing both the sort of the time of the stroke and the distance, the triangulated distance of the stroke to within about a half-kilometer accuracy, which is pretty good, especially in mountainous terrain, which can be worse than half a kilometer, but we won't talk about that. And for the precipitation, I used, as my title suggests, I have a multi-data set assessment. I used 4 different precipitation data sets. But my sort of main results were based on this multi-radar, multi-sensor MRMS system. This is a radar-based, gauge-corrected precipitation data set put out by NOAA, and it's a 1-kilometer data set, which is really good for sort of large-scale, landscape-scale applications. And I'll talk about this a bit more, but it made the most sense to use radar data because there aren't that many weather stations in the West, and satellite data has some drawbacks, specifically for dry lightning, which I'll touch on also. And so before I move on, I'll touch on 2 different kinds of lightning-caused fires. I'll talk about promptly detected fires, which are those fires which were detected basically within 1 day of ignition. Lightning happens, and within a day, that fire is discovered by people. There is also the holdover fires. These are different. These are your smoldering fires, where it might be cooler, it might be wetter, so lightning might ignite, for example, underneath the forest canopy, and sort of smolder in the litter and the duff for a couple days, sometimes 5 days or even longer. And then when conditions dry out, perhaps get hotter, perhaps windier, that fire then kind of spreads and becomes a large enough fire to be seen by people. So the discovery date of that fire might be 2, 5, 7 days after the actual ignition date. And so we have to kind of account for that too, because if I look for lightning, it has to be some number of days before the actual discovery date. So I'll talk about that and how those are different. So my main challenge here was to find a way to sensibly combine wildfire data, lightning data, and precipitation data. So this is just an example, not a real fire, but you might have a lat-long coordinate of a fire in the middle there, and then you have your NLDN lightning data, and it shows all of those contact points, cloud to ground contact points. But notice how, in this case, none of them are near the fire, which happens because there's spatial uncertainty in both the lightning data and the fire data. So you have these examples where there isn't actually a lightning strike anywhere near where the fire happened, even though we know they're lightning-caused fires, because that's determined by federal investigators. And we have this grid. I have overlain the 1 kilometer MRMS precipitation grid, for which I have rainfall data. And so to deal with this sort of spatial uncertainty, I do a 2 kilometer radius search, and I look for the closest occurrence of cloud-to-ground lightning to that fire discovery location. And then I basically take that closest lightning strike and extract rainfall data from that location, right? So that's spatial uncertainty. And now we have the temporal uncertainty. This is that holdover lag time. So if I don't see lightning on the same day as the fire report, I search backwards sequentially up to 5 days back in time. If there's no lightning within 5 days, I just discard that data because it's just uncertain if the fire was actually ignited 7 days ago or 10 days ago, or at that point, is that just a mistake in the database? So I just look back up to 5 days. And using this spatio-temporal search criteria, I was able to successfully match 80% of the fires with lightning. So those are the 80% I moved forward with. It's about 3,700 fires over that 6-year period. And so the first sort of quick high-level result here is if we take those 3,700 fires and I extract all the rainfall amounts, take the median, it's 2.8 millimeters, which is actually pretty close to this rule of thumb 2.5 millimeter threshold. If you're more familiar with the US system, remember 2.5 millimeters is 1/10 of an inch, so 2.8 is like 0.11, 0.12 inches. So yeah, it's pretty close, right? I don't even know where the 2.5 millimeter came from. I've seen it as far back as 1990s papers, so it's been around. Apparently it's pretty good, but that's just the median. If you look at the interquartile range, you can see that there's actually quite a bit of spread, right? That's actually 1 to 6.2 millimeters. So that warrants further digging. So here's what the other 4 data sets show. So for this study, I have the MRMS. I use the MRMS radar-based data set up top. Then I have the NASA satellite-based data set, which is this GPM iMERGE, Global Precipitation Measuring Mission merged data set. I used GridMet, which is actually put out by my advisor, John Abatsoglu. He developed it back in 2013. And that's weighted towards ground sensors, so ground precipitation gauges, but with input from NLDAS, land surface model. But mostly, it's mostly coming from interpolated surface gauge data. And finally, I brought in this multi-source weighted ensemble, MSWEP, data set, which is interesting. It kind of blends satellite, it blends reanalysis, it blends surface gauge data, and I didn't put it on here, but it also actually ingests runoff data. So for example, in the US, it'll ingest the USGS runoff data to sort of bias correct precipitation amounts if they don't match how much runoff was recorded downstream. So it's pretty clever, which gave me hope. But then when I compared these data sets on the bottom, that's the medians and distributions. For some odd reason, that MSWeb data set was not aligning with the others. Somebody could argue maybe MSWeb is right. Maybe it really is that dry, only 0.4 millimeters when lightning starts fires. But I get the feeling that just given the heuristic of 2.5 millimeters that's been out there for 30 years, and given what the other data sets show, it's more likely that MSWeb has some issues with sensing rainfall in the western US for whatever reason. And more likely, the other three are more correct. One important note here is that I have a note here below the table that all of these data sets are gauge corrected. So even though they're coming from radar, they're coming from satellites, reanalysis, they all rely on ground-based rainfall measurement. It's critical to these data sets. So just sticking with the in situ theme of this talk, as a user, as an applied scientist myself, I very much depend on ground data in my work. And so this was sort of the uncertainty with the different data sets, right? So now we can talk about variation spatially. So again, the overall Western US median number was 2.5 millimeters, but if you look at how this number varies across the different ecoregions or eco-provinces, yeah, quite a bit different. If you're in Arizona, in the mountains, it's like 5.2 millimeters, but if you're in the drier areas of Eastern Oregon, Southern Idaho, it's more like 1.7 millimeters. And this can be really important if you're trying to build predictive models for wildfires, for example, or even just operational forecasting of potential lightning starts and pre-positioning of resources, suppression resources. It's good to know what are the actual, critical rainfall amounts for potential ignitions when lightning is forecast during the summer, which is your fire season. And so here's the same information that you see in the map. It's now just broken out by the distributions. And I'm going to throw in the other three data sets for comparison here. Here they are for each eco-province. And yeah, you can see, again, going back to MSWeb, it's consistently lower, even though it assimilates all those data sources. It's, for whatever reason, consistently lower in what it says are the ignition precipitation amounts when lightning starts fires. But, if you look at individual eco-provinces, there are interesting sort of commonalities in some of them. For example, for the American desert, which is, southeastern California, southern Arizona, the three main data sets above, the radar, satellite, and surface gauge-based data sets all kind of agree. They all paint a pretty similar picture of these ignition precipitation amounts, which is good if you're trying to model wildfire ignition there. It should give you confidence that different sources of data give you similar numbers, right? Except for MSWeb, who knows why. If you look at the Cascades, which is right over here, somewhere, wherever the Cascades are, that way. Yeah, the radar and satellite data sets agree, but the surface gauge-based GridMet does not agree. That could be because there might be fewer stations in the mountains to sort of interpolate from, so they're missing the sort of convective pop-up, thunderstorms. It could be that. Oh, and I promised I would touch on why satellite data might not be ideal. Remember, we're dealing with dry lightning here, which needs sort of a dry, lower atmosphere to evaporate rainfall. And based on what I've seen, it seems like, in just conversations with my colleagues, it seems like a satellite product like iMerge, and this is nothing against NASA, it's just general satellite products, they can't really resolve that subcloud dry layer. So they have their, sensing instrument, which knows how much moisture is in the atmosphere, but it doesn't know how much of that is actually evaporating before it hits the ground. So it thinks more rain fell, potentially. That's one potential issue with relying on satellite data. And one of the reasons I went with radar data, because radar beams are based on the ground, they scan outward, so they catch Not the full subcloud layer, but at least more of it, to give you a little better idea of how much rain actually reached the surface, or at least near surface. And then for GridMet, again, that's surface gauge based. In areas where there aren't many surface gauges, it's not going to catch, it's just going to interpolate and not actually know where thunderstorms occurred, so you're going to miss rainfall if you rely on that data set primarily. So that's why I kind of built my results around MRMS for this study, radar-based. And then I'm running out of time, but real quick, I wanted to show this map. This is the difference in ignition amounts between those promptly detected and holdover fires. Quick takeaway here is that these holdover fires actually occur with quite a bit more rainfall, about double the rainfall compared to promptly detected fires. And again, that's because, as you might imagine, if the fire smolders, conditions were probably cooler and wetter, so more rain could have actually fallen, and then that fire kind of waits until conditions improve for burning, hotter, drier, potentially days later, then it blows up. But again, if you're a forecaster or like fire management personnel, you want to know about this. You'd want to know that higher precipitation amounts, and specifically how much higher, can still pose a fire risk and potential suppression, needs 5-7 days later, right? I'll skip over this. This basically shows that conditions are cooler and wetter when holdover fires happen. And yeah, so main takeaways here is that, I guess the first takeaway is that this old heuristic of 2.5 millimeters is actually a decent approximation, but only if you aggregate over the entire western US. If you dig deeper, you see there's actually large spatial variation in these median ignition precipitation amounts spatially, and there are significant differences depending on if the fire blew up right away or held over for a few days. And as I showed, there's also uncertainty in which precipitation data set you use. So it can be a lot more complicated than simply saying, 2.5 millimeters or less is a fire risk, and above that is not a fire risk. These results were published. I have the paper here from a couple of years ago now. And yeah, thanks everyone for listening, and I'll be happy to have any discussions afterward. Should I stay up here now, or are we doing questions? We can do questions now. Okay, sounds good. Okay.
Are there any questions?
Should I use the mic just for the virtual people? Thanks, Dimitri. Very interesting. So lightning is not just a linear, one-dimensional thing, right? I'm just curious about this sort of spatial, what kind of area can actually be affected by a ground lightning strike, given that it can be quite complex, right?
Multi-strokes.
Yeah,
Potentially.
and I assume the lightning detection just sort of assumes, which is understandable, that there's like a point, right? But in reality, it might actually affect a larger area. I'm just kind of interested in what your thought process was. And you talked about your 2-kilometer buffer that you drew, but I was just sort of curious about that. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question. That's kind of swept under the rug a little bit. But yes, it's a great point. So the data I use is flash level data. So basically it aggregates any multiple strokes. So just to quickly define, when you see an actual lightning, cloud to ground lightning discharge, there's the main sort of discharge, but you can have multiple ground contact points where it branches out. It's called stroke multiplicity. You can have only one contact point, or you can have like 8 or 10 sometimes, where there's 8 or 10 ground contact points from a single flash, and those could be a kilometer apart. So it can be tough to actually figure out of those, let's say, 8 multiple strokes, which is the one that set the fire going, right? So yeah, the flash data I think they average, I don't exactly know how they aggregate the multiple strokes into the flash level data. I think they average them into one or median or something. But yes, yeah, so I don't actually have the specific down to the meter contact points with the ground because of that. Of course. You have a question?
Yeah, again, really interesting talk. Thanks for sharing your insights. I'm wondering, in terms of looking at this from a predictive point of view, have you gone back and looked at what were the predicted rainfall amounts for those areas under the different models compared to what was seen? And if there's any interesting tendencies in what's the predicted amount of rainfall with these ignition points?
Good question. I haven't myself, just because that hasn't really been a part of my work, looking at model, like operational forecast models. But that would be, I think, an interesting validation study. I think I would say more so like for the people like doing that sort of operational forecasting, maybe less so the sort of, geospatial environmental practitioners, so to speak, in this case, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. And the regions you showed line up sort of well, but not perfectly with some of the PSAs for risk modeling, like from NWCC. So there's maybe some overlap there too.
Yeah, it would be really cool if somebody actually looked at that. If we had some sort of like real-time knowledge, if we know, well, the model is showing 3 millimeters of rain will fall, but we know it's 30% too high, right? That'd be really cool to know. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm curious if in addition to sort of looking at this spatial variation in the eco provinces and, what the precipitation levels were, if you also looked at like the vegetation structure and how much water is being stored in that region, as opposed to just how much is falling.
No, another good question, good point. Other studies have looked at this in terms of like live fuel moisture in particular. There was a study by last name Rao, R-A-O. You've probably seen it, seems like you're nodding, about importance of live fuel moisture to lightning caused fire ignition. And yeah, they use like canopy water data and stuff like that, but I haven't personally touched that data myself. Yeah.
Thank you, Dimitri.
Okay.
We will have time for questions after the three talks too. So we have that Slido link if you want to post questions there or in the chat on Zoom. We can get back to him after our other two speakers go. So let me get out of here. Next up, we have Dr. Mallory Barnes, who will be speaking through Zoom. I have to figure out how to, okay, how do I do Zoom? Sorry.
What are you trying to?
Make it bigger so we can see the speaker.
So just go to.
This one, okay, sorry. Okay. Mallory, you have a co-host. Are you able to share your screen?
Yeah, let me try.
Cool.
Is that working?
It is working, okay.
You could probably stop sharing this one.
Am I sharing? Okay. I will stop sharing on here. Okay, excellent. Okay, do I need to do anything else? Okay. This is Dr. Mallory Barnes. She's an associate professor at Indiana University who studies carbon and nature-based climate solutions and who is also happens to be my advisor. So welcome, Mallory. You may start whenever you're ready.
All right, great. Thanks, Cassandra. Let me know, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you perfect.
Okay, great. So today I'm going to talk to you about how we use the integration of in situ data and satellite data to try and quantify some aspects of nature-based climate solutions. So first, I was asked to do a plain language summary of the work that I'll be presenting. So I thought I would start there. So the broad question to think about is, what do forests do for the climate? And so forests are kind of like Earth's air conditioners. They cool the places around them. So if you've ever been to a park on a really hot day compared to the parking lot that you came from, you know that forests really help cool things off. And they also store carbon. And so they help with both heat that we feel and also climate change by taking carbon out of the atmosphere and using it to build their bodies. So measuring how much they help and where they will help isn't really simple. And so I'm going to show how combining ground-based data and satellite data helps give us a clearer picture. So before I dive into some of the work, I wanted to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what are nature-based climate solutions and why should we care about them. So nature-based climate solutions are kind of a hot topic in environmental science the last like maybe 5-10 years. And so if you study carbon, you know that ecosystems already give us a huge discount on our annual anthropogenic carbon emissions. They absorb 25 to 33% of our human emissions annually. So this is already slowing down climate change a lot more than it would be progressing if forests weren't doing their thing. Nature-based climate solutions are a suite of different types of practices that are aimed to further reduce carbon sequestration, so kind of taking out additional carbon beyond what ecosystems already do, and therefore reducing atmospheric CO2. So there's a few key categories of nature-based climate solutions. And so this is a nice image from the Nature Conservancy. It includes things like protecting existing ecosystems, so protecting forests, wetlands, grasslands. It includes management. So that's things like different forest management strategies, cropland management strategies like cover cropping, and then restoring. So that can include things like reforestation or wetland restoration. Whenever I give a talk that includes nature-based climate solutions, I always want to put on the brakes for a second, because it's really important to remember that nature-based climate solutions aren't a substitute for the massive, rapid carbon emission reductions that we need to address climate change. So these are not something that can replace what we need to do to stop climate change. And so that's always something I like to say. So the way that I think about nature-based climate solutions is that we need to think about carbon, but we also need to think about other benefits that these nature-based climate solutions can provide. So nature-based climate solutions are really popular and people are interested in them largely because of their mitigation potential. And so this is really important, of course, but nature-based climate solutions are often more uncertain than you would think in terms of the amount of carbon that they can actually sequester and whether that carbon sequestration ends up being permanent. So they might sequester carbon, but let's say a reforestation project goes up in flames, like from a lightning-induced fire in the Western United States, like we just heard about. Well, then all of that carbon is released right back to the atmosphere. I think an underappreciated benefit, though, at least in terms of when we're thinking about like large-scale climate planning of nature-based climate solutions, is that a lot of them also have really important benefits on water and energy cycles. And so this is from biophysical effects of vegetation typically. And so I'm going to be talking mostly about reforestation, which can have really large cooling effects through evapotranspiration and increased surface roughness. And so if these if these cooling benefits happen at a time when it's hot and heat relief is needed, then these can really be important climate adaptation strategies in addition to the mitigation of the carbon piece. And so I think something that I like to think about is how can we have more holistically informed nature-based climate solutions by considering both of these aspects. And so now I'm going to move into two different case studies of examples of how we've tried to measure nature-based climate solution benefits across scales in terms of cooling, so temperature, and then carbon. So this is the first case study here. And so this is looking at forest cooling across the eastern United States. So I don't have time to get into it, but the eastern United States has a really interesting history of land use change. In the 17 and 1800s, almost all of the forests in the eastern United States were cut down as colonizers moved through the eastern United States, moving west. And then in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was really this massive agricultural abandonment as people left agricultural fields and moved into cities. And then at the same time, in the early 1900s, there was a really active tree planting efforts in this region. Over 1 billion trees were planted as through things like the New Deal and the Civilian Conservation Corps. So there's this massive history of reforestation that's really happened in the 20th century in the eastern United States. And then at the same time, there's this thing, I didn't name it, it's called the Southeast Warming Hole. And so that's what we're looking at here on the right. This is a map looking at the temperature change over the last 100 years. And you can see the eastern United States has not heated up like everywhere else has. And in fact, it's cooled very slightly. So this has been dubbed the warming hole, meaning why hasn't it heated up like everywhere else has? And so there have been different explanations postulated, but what we wanted to answer with this work was, does this southeastern US warming hole, can it be explained by this interesting legacy of 20th century reforestation? So to do that, we have to detect the climate impacts of land cover change. And so here's where this like multi-scale research design comes in. And so land cover changes can cool the land surface, but we don't know where, we don't know the mechanism always, and we don't know whether that cooling that we know happens locally is going to scale up to large regions. So here we're using 2 different types of measurements. We're using flux towers, which Cassandra mentioned earlier. And so these are towers that capture really detailed exchanges of energy, water, and carbon, which I'll talk about later. But for our purposes now, mostly energy exchange between the land and the atmosphere. And then satellites, as most of you, I think, knew something about satellites, they can be really useful for revealing these broad spatial patterns. And so what we did was we used both to compare forest and non-forest areas across the eastern US as a proxy for the impact of reforestation on climate. And so here's some results. This shows that, and this is from the satellites, showing that forests are cooling surface temperatures. So what we're seeing here is basically summer surface temperature. The top row is forests and the bottom row is crops and grasslands. And so what I want you to notice is that there's a lot more blue on the top row than the bottom row, which means that forests are cooling the surface a lot more than co-located grasses and crops. And in fact, this shows that forests are 2 to 5 degrees Celsius cooler than nearby non-forest areas in summer. So this is a pretty big effect. But what we wanted to do first was we wanted to confirm this magnitude and this effect using flux towers. So we have these towers throughout the eastern United States. There aren't that many of them, maybe 30. And so we looked at flux towers that were closely paired with grassland or non-forest. And so we confirmed that this surface cooling was happening. But one really cool thing we were also able to do was look at the impact of forests on air temperatures. So here we're looking at this basically metric of air temperature on the y-axis across these different land cover types. And what we were able to see was that not only does forests have an impact on surface temperature, but that cooling effect actually extends to the air. So these forests, large forests, have a cooling effect on air temperature. And so together, these data sets provided really strong evidence that forests cooled their local environment and that it extended to the air. I'm not going to be able to get into more details about how we were actually able to use historical data to attribute some of the fingerprint of the reforestation to the warming hole, but feel free to read the paper to learn more about that. So we want to follow on with this work and look at cooling in urban settings. And so to do that, we are using a thermal UAV, a drone. And so this is really important for climate adaptation because there are urban heat islands and people live in cities. And so we want to try and help quantify these climate adaptation benefits in urban forest settings. So to do this, we use UAVs because they have really fine scale and we can fly them wherever we want. And so the goal with this work, we've done some pilot work, so you can see these images here on the left. This is looking at an image from a thermal drone, and there's kind of like a clear-cut patch in the middle of a forest. And so yellow is warm, and so you can see there's a large difference in temperature between this clear-cut patch and the surrounding forest. And so we are going to be moving forward with this, and the goal would be to help cities track where and when trees cool their surrounding environments and how much cooling they provide on these hot days. Next, I'm going to move on to the second case study, which is looking at carbon in this nature-based climate solution context. So as I mentioned, nature-based climate solutions are this suite of different practices where we're trying to sustain or improve the amount of carbon that ecosystems are taking out of the atmosphere. And an important thing to know is that nature-based climate solutions are actually likely necessary to meet warming targets. So here on the right, this is a figure where we're looking at the global carbon emissions. We're looking at what would happen all the way into 2050 if we have business as usual emissions, even if the fossil fuel mitigation happens that we really need to happen. This green band here, additional cooling from nature-based climate solutions is likely required to keep us below warming targets like the 2 degrees Celsius threshold. There is a lot of operational issues with some of these forest carbon solutions. There's like all these carbon crediting systems, carbon markets, but there's a big credibility gap. There's a high enthusiasm, but there's not a lot of scientific rigor. And when we think about what are some of the causes of this issue, we have to think about baselines. So for a forest carbon project to result in meaningful carbon reductions in the atmosphere, it has to do more than it would have done if you had just left it alone. And so we need to have baselines that help us understand this concept of additionality. Current baselines are problematic. They are not standardized. Sometimes the people that profit from the forest carbon projects are allowed to set the baselines themselves. And so the question we ask here is how can we build more accurate, transparent, and dynamic carbon baselines for forest carbon monitoring? This work is funded by the NASA CMS carbon monitoring system. And so we are trying to build the first dynamic baseline specifically designed to evaluate this additionality from forest-based carbon solutions. And we're again using a combination of remote sensing and flux tower data to do that. This here is an example of what you might end up happening in static baselines here with this blue dotted line. If you go out and measure your forest carbon project, depending on the year that you go out and measure it and what's actually happening that year, you might end up over or under crediting a forest carbon project. Dynamic baselines are updated every year. They are informed by broader climate and meteorology. And so these are going to align more with real ecosystem behavior, and thus we are getting accurate crediting regardless of when we go out and measure. So for this project, we are integrating fluxes and remote sensing. And so this is kind of a little bit different than I described before because these represent options for the two ways that we try and estimate how much carbon is in forests. So now most forest carbon projects are thought of as these forest carbon stock estimates. So how much carbon is in these standing trees is kind of what we use as a baseline. But one thing about that is that it doesn't account for all of these other pools, all of the below ground stuff that's going on. And so these eddy covariance flux towers that I mentioned before integrate over the different carbon pools, and so they should be able to give us a different picture of what's going on with the forest carbon. And so in this work, we're combining flux tower data with remote sensing, and we're trying to integrate these ground-based observations from the flux towers with satellite observations to track short-term fluxes and this long-term stock change. We are trying to leverage the strengths of both of these approaches so that we have more comprehensive and scalable carbon accounting. And so here I have a little like diagram of the things that stocks are good at, the things that fluxes are good at in terms of what they're good at measuring. And so rather than having you read all these, the point is that these each have strengths and weaknesses, and we're trying to leverage both. The way that we're doing that in this project is with machine learning. And so we use machine learning models to upscale carbon stock estimates from plot data from the forest inventory and analysis. And we also use them to upscale carbon fluxes from the eddy covariance towers. So here on the right, I have a schematic of how we do this upscaling process. So we will have our flux towers, and they will have these time series of, in our case, carbon exchange. And then we will stack those all up on gridded predictors, things like NDVI, greenness from satellites, things like meteorological variables. We will use machine learning algorithms then to try and extract the relationships between the real fluxes and these gridded predictors so that we have a predictive model. Then we can feed a whole set of those gridded inputs into that predictive model, and that gives us these wall-to-wall flux estimates. So we have continuous stock and flux-based carbon products when we're all done with this. This is kind of a busy figure, but I just wanted to illustrate here the different components of this approach. So we have these in situ measurements and observations. We have our flux towers. We are using things like tree cores, and we are also using other types of in situ measurements to try and really figure out what the real carbon exchange is. Then we use these scaling tools and approaches. In my case, we are using machine learning upscaling with remote sensing data, and those give us these wall-to-wall estimates of carbon stocks and fluxes that we then can use to create these dynamic baselines. So finishing up here, I've shown you two different case studies of how we have used this cross-scale data integration to try and make climate solutions more credible. And I also talked about how forests have dual climate benefits in terms of cooling or adaptation and carbon storage for mitigation. Tracking these benefits is requiring us to integrate flux towers, satellites, and in this case, machine learning or using machine learning. We talked about these dynamic carbon baselines and thermal mapping. So these are two ways that we can try and make nature-based climate solutions more accountable and actionable. And so this kind of cross-scale integration is really important for lots of different aspects of environmental science, but hopefully it'll also help make climate models better, data products better, and decision-making can be more trustworthy. So that's all I've got. So thanks for listening.
I don't know if you could hear, but the whole room clapped for you.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Okay, does anyone have any questions for Mallory? We do have a microphone somewhere. Do you guys have it? Okay, we got a few. So I think you should be able to hear them.
Hello. That was a really interesting talk, Mallory. Thank you.
Thanks.
I've been thinking about this. I'm a terrestrial ecologist and study plant community dynamics. And I was kind of thinking about this nature-based climate solutions concept and how it relates to sort of like the plant economic spectrum and fast versus slow species and how that affects the carbon cycle. And I think this might just be a comment instead of a question. I think you're getting at that with this approach. I think that you're kind of capturing that fast versus slow carbon cycling by incorporating these data sets. Do you agree? I guess it is a question.
Yeah, though that's a really interesting point. I think to some extent we are are, like we are getting at fast carbon changes from those flux towers. I don't think I was clear, but you probably know that they measure super, super quick, right? So what is it, Cassandra, 10 hertz, 10 times per second?
Yeah.
And so that is really, really fast exchanges of carbon. And then, yeah, especially these stock-based estimates, right? These are very slow changes in carbon stocks that happen over time. So I think we're getting to that, like, that to some extent, but I am really interested in, species-specific differences in these, because you talk about, the different traits. We're not really looking at plant traits at all right now, except maybe like, coniferous versus deciduous, right? Like that's as fine as we're going. So I think there's really cool opportunities to link some of this work to more, like detailed ecological trait type analyses. But yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, and I think I'll add, I was thinking about this sort of in species-specific kind of reforestation efforts. Like, what does that mean sort of over the long term? You mentioned like 3 years versus 12 years. And I'm thinking, if you can plant super fast-growing species, that could be great for the short term, and maybe that is the answer. But in 50 years, is that, then what are the impacts, and how can we kind of think ahead in these species-specific reforestation efforts or the trees that we plant in our cities? So that's sort of the angle that I was coming at this from. But yes, that would be a really fun thing to connect with this work in the future. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for the talk. That was very interesting. One question I have for you is that relates to the fact that much of the carbon markets are based in parts of the world that don't necessarily have the scientific infrastructure to stand up a flux tower and collect fluxes over a sufficient period to get an upscaling model like you have here. And so instead they rely on more classic, like in the case of forests, like inventories of like collecting DBH and whatnot. In the future though, it would be sure nice to have dynamic baselines. And so once you have this upscaling approach, what then do you think of the potential for side scaling to try and apply those ideas in places where we don't necessarily have flux infrastructure?
That's a good question. I've done some other types of machine learning upscaling in drylands, and so we actually did do exactly that. Like we built a model on Southwest US drylands and then applied it in Australia, and kind of, this was more exploratory, but we did publish it, and kind of like, how did it do? And so again, that is really like, yeah, they're still drylands, right? But they're very different in terms of their ecological function and how, what do you expect and what does the model do? So I think there's certainly possibilities for it, but I would be very uncomfortable doing that without at least some ability to do some sort of ground validation. And I'm not saying we have to put up more flux towers everywhere, but I feel like there could be ways to do some sort of lower cost validation that would satisfy some of these concerns. And I haven't thought too hard about it, but I think there are like, different types of, I don't know how you would do it, but I think I'm not comfortable just being like, yes, this is the standard for everywhere, but I don't have any ground data. So I think that's a really interesting question, and one I would be happy to think more about.
Okay. One more.
Thank you for the talk. I know this is more of a comment, I think, rather than a question, but one climate impact that you didn't discuss is on precipitation regimes. And of course, we're seeing especially the situation in Amazonia now, where we've seen the deforestation, and now there's an unprecedented drought widespread in Brazil. So I think the point you made about decision-making to kind of set priorities for reforestation to take into account the potential modeled precipitation impacts would be important, to kind of factor that into the equation. And that might change some of the thought process. It's like another factor, since you have these complicated feedback loops between the vegetation and the precipitation. Just kind of wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point for sure. Yeah, I think vegetation precipitation interactions are really important. Also, like vegetation albedo interactions are really important. I didn't mention that here, but that's something I've been thinking about too. So yeah, forests have lots of impacts that are useful to consider. I'm not like a, meteorologist or someone who can do that like atmospheric modeling, but I think that it's super important to consider when we think about these nature-based climate solutions.
Okay, thank you guys. She's also in Zoom, so we can put questions in the chat where she can answer directly, or she can, I don't know. Anyway, thank you, Mallory, for your excellent talk. Next up, we have Shen Wang, who should be able to share her screen. Okay.
You see my screen?
We can hear you as well. So welcome, Shen. Shen is a postdoc at Indiana University Bloomington who works pretty closely with Dr. Mallory Barnes and myself. So thank you for coming, and we are excited to hear about sensing photosynthesis across scales.
Okay, do I need to make the expanding of the slides? Oh, it's just, okay.
Can you do full screen? We see
Okay, I might just share.
okay.
Okay, so just sharing the second screen maybe.
There we go. Perfect.
Thank you for inviting me here, Cassandra. And also, like, I'm happy to follow Mary's work because she apparently talk about how important of carbon, like how important of the carbon. Sorry, there's something weird going on. So how important of quantify carbon. So today I'm going to talk about how to sensing photosynthesis across scales. This is a majority is actually is my PhD work. So the photosynthesis is generally important because it's actually taking CO2 and produce energy and make it key to how land storage carbons, which have currently we have a lot of extra CO2 in the atmosphere. So these land ecosystems also play a big role to uptake some of the human-made carbon emissions. And then Mary already talked about nature-based climate solutions, for example, reforestation. But before we implement those solutions, I think it's really important for us to accurate kind of quantify those photosynthesis or carbon storage by any kind of vegetation types. But we still have a large uncertainty to quantify the photosynthesis. So here is just a paper showing a large uncertainties of the photosynthesis across the global scale. And especially the dryland ecosystems was playing a big role of the global photosynthetic uptake. The reason is that the dryland ecosystem, because the dryland ecosystems the different combination of vegetation types. So the one that I show in the pictures, they have a different vegetation types, including like shrublands and proportion of grass, and also the soil background. And those those proportions actually really different sensitive to the rainfall. And these variations and their different sensitivity to the rainfall actually create this semi-arid land has large interannual variability compared to other ecosystems at this global scale. Even though the drylands has large interannual variability, but then the current the product to quantify those variability has low accuracy. So here I'm just still showing the same picture, and then the gross primary productivity, which is the GBP I showing here, is to indicate the photosynthetic CO2 uptake which is just quantify how much photosynthesis takes CO2. And then one of the reason for us to poorly to represent the GBP into annual variability because of the vegetation greenness index. I'm showing the most traditional one, which is called NDVI. You can just simplify it thinking this is more indicate greenness of the vegetation, and they are pretty poorly to capture the vegetation heterogeneity and also the soil background in these dryland ecosystems. So what we want to do is more thinking about not just using those greenness index, but also using more newer technology, and we call it soil-induced fluorescence. So the soil-induced so this picture actually trying to showing some little bit mechanisms about how we think in soil-induced fluorescence could be a better indicator of photosynthesis. So we could thinking about this APAR, this kind of like a leaf, and then it's absorbing sunlight, and then majority of the energy is going to do the photosynthesis. And then the second pathway is the fluorescence. Is actually only release like emit actually less than 2% of the light. And then the third pathway we call it stress response pathway is non-photochemical quenching. We just like simplified as NPQ. So in this process, there's a safe spectrum that could be emitted when the vegetation doing photosynthesis. So when we have the reception in the sky, and we can receive this soil-induced fluorescence signals, and then using these signals, we can quantify kind of indicating or suggest how much vegetation doing photosynthesis. And this is we're using the GBP again to indicate that. And then, okay. And then we also going to, when we study about this soil-induced fluorescence, we also want to combine different pathway or any different piece of information to put all the whole picture together. So we also put reflectivity of the leaf surface. So here again, we go back to this greenness index, we call it NDVI. And then with the time, when I was doing PhD, and then those indices are moving forward because they have limitations of doing it. So the second index is called NRV, which is further modified based on NDVI to reduce the soil background information because the dryland ecosystem usually have big proportions of the soil background. And third one, they just furthermore improved based on NRV, which is add the radiation element based on this greenness index. And then the other indices we used here is called VUD, which is vegetation optical depth. It's a microwave remote sensing, so it's can penetrate the whole vegetation. It's more and is the wavelength is more sensitive to the water, so it's actually indicating the water content and biomass of trees or any vegetations. And then there's this one is kind of related to the different. I think the pathway is not really specific to indicate one of them. The third pathway we will do the last is called NPQ. And then when the vegetation experience a lot of stress, and those pathway is going to open up, and then there's other elements is going on in that pathway, and then the pigment content will change, so the reflectivity is also will change. So this PRI signal, which is photochemical reflectivity indices, is going to increase based on those this pathway when the vegetation doing photosynthesis. So now the question, I guess, it was just a whole system about understanding about photosynthesis process and how soil-induced fluorescence actually played a role in that process. So the key scientific question I was trying to answer in my PhD is soil-induced fluorescence and other remote sensing proxies reliable, actually track the photosynthesis in dryland ecosystem across scales. So the scales I generally applied from leaf level. So we have those called Lycol. You can put the leaves inside. It's in controlled system, so you can control the temperature, soil moisture, and VPD stuff, and you can measure the carbon flux, or we call it a simulation in that system. And then we also build the remote sensors of ourselves, which is co-located with the flag tower sites, which I think Mary and Cassandra already talked before. So this, but we also put our own remote sensors. So when they combine together, you actually have a lot of information to understand at a canopy to just the regional scale. So here regional scale, I think we are only talking about like several hundred to kilometer, kind of that big area. And then later on, I also apply some the same thing applied to the Cantilentro, which is the southwestern United States, and also at the global dryland scales. So here, the first question I was asking, which all these remotely sensed proxies actually best tracks GBP across the global dryland ecosystems. So here is a lot of figures. So still go back to this leaf absorbing light, and then you will take CO2 and then use some water, and you're going to emit safe data and also reflect to the reflectivity, which we calculate NDVI at that time. So these different remote sensing proxies actually comes from the different wavelengths. So the visible band or near infrared band, they have a less longer wavelengths. So they usually just measure the land surface. So NDVI is the graininess index, still the surface graininess, and then safe data is also more, like we talked about before, is more more direct compared to graininess index. It's a more direct photosynthetic index, but still in the surface. But then the microwave, because of a longer wavelength, so you can penetrate all this vegetation, so they can measure all this canopy above ground biomass or water content. We call it VOD. So this is, we're trying to compare them. So those three different indices kind of direct or indirect related to the photosynthesis. And we again compare to all this to the ground reference data, which is from equivariance GBP. So I think Mary already talking about a lot about equivariance GBP is high technique. So we can use them as ground reference data, but I don't think we're going to install everywhere. So that's why we're using remote sensing data to validate it by the equivariance GBP data. And then this is some key results. This is the global dryland GBP dynamics. The y-axis is the normalized indices. X-axis is the monthly, different months. So generally the black color is GBP, red color is safe data, and the green color is NDVI, and the blue color is VOD. So generally speaking, at this global dryland scale, the safe data is better to capture the seasonal GBP compared to NDVI or the VOD data. Even though it seems like VOD indicating water content, it seems more reasonable, but actually the safe data is more direct to the photosynthesis. It's better to track the GBP at dryland ecosystem. And then later on, we were thinking why safe data actually can capture GBP across these heterogeneous sites. So this is the second study we have, and then we are using like 22 equivariance flag tower sites, and we are using different proportions of vegetation types across these 22 sites, and we further kind of like define what is the heterogeneity. So we just classify those sites into 6 categories, which is tree close and tree sparse and shrub close and shrub sparse, grass close and grass sparse. So because the different combinations of the vegetation types. So again, we're trying to understand what the indices actually capture GBP. So the first, the y-axis is the accuracy of the proxies in capturing GBP. X-axis is average GBP. So the NDVI, it was just more spread out. And then NRV, which is the indices improved by NDVI, so it's less impact by soil background. So the majority of the sites increase their accuracy, but then there's a size actually is less. It's improved, but still not great. So those sites are actually dominated by the evergreen species. So then we have this safe also. A lot of sites actually increased, but then we also have the sites have low productivity and it couldn't really accurately capture by the SIP data. I think this is because of the low signal to noise ratio, because this is new technique, we still have a problem about the low signal to noise ratio problem. That's why they cannot really capture the low productivity sites which have low signal. Again, this is still the same, the three different proxies, but the y-axis is GPP now. So we're trying to understand if those three different indices actually capture differently at the seasonal scale. So this is for the size you you see in the picture, still the patches of grass and patches of the shrubs. So we actually find this interesting hysteresis, or we actually call it seasonal bias. It's actually happened at end of the growing season. So what is really happened is that at the end of growing season, those hardy deciduous, we call it also shrubs, the leaves still stay green, but then the photosynthesis is shutting down. So those reflectance based, which is NDVI or NRV, is more greenness index, cannot really capture that. But then the SIP data actually pretty nicely to capture those. So the I think the mechanism is that the SIP data is not only capture this greenness, but also there's a immediately or instinct the physiological response of the vegetation at that time. They also capture that. So we just summarize as physiological information. So the SIP incorporate the both information. That's why they're better. So now we trying to deep this side a little bit more. So how about this mixed site experience droughts? So again, we go back to this figures, the leaves absorbing light and then reflect some light. Now we further improve this greenness index and add a little bit more information about radiation. Still, we're going to using SIP data, but also we're going to incorporate this stress response process called PRI to understand what's going on for this vegetation. So we install those different sensors at the relative more like dominated by grassland sites, but they also have like 10 to 20% of this shrub in that region. So this is a phenocam imagery in August 2019. So they are pretty green. This is a typical how they looks like during the growing season. But in 2020 August, so you can see the ecosystem was really kind of rough because they experienced a really drought during that growing season. So what's the dynamics of the GBP at that ecosystem was more like this. So the y-axis GBP, and then this the black color is the average of the GBP for the decade. So it's more represent what's going on in that site. So that site usually have a spring kind of increase of GBP, but less because of a temperature. And then later on, they have more like a growing season during the monsoon because the monsoon precipitation arrives. So they are just making this grass and the shrubs surviving. And then this 2019 was pretty close to that dynamics, but 2020 was not because of the large drought during the summer. So we're trying to keep all these different indices and see what's going on for those vegetations. So here we have this 2020 from April to October. So the black one is GBP, and then the safe was captures the spring, but then they have a little bit weird bumps in after a rainfall events. And the same thing happened for the PRI, which is a stress response indices. But then the NRVP, which is more like a structure or just a greenness index, a little bit better than the other indices. I mean, compared to other greenness indices, they more capture this structure changes. So when this rain event was only happened at end of August, it's actually make the significant change of GBP and PRI and a little bit significant change of the, a little bit significant change of the GBP, but the big change of the safe data and PRI data. I think the hypothesis that we have is that this NRVP was more structure dominant information, but then the other three indices that not only have structure, but also the physiological information that they have. So, so if we want to remove all this structure information, we want to understand what is the physiological information in these three different pathway and how they respond to the stress. Sorry. So this hypothetically, if they have like before the structure changes, or we just thinking the structure is not changing, and then this vegetation was heated by a stress. So the first one is photosynthesis, they're going to reduce, and then followed by this fluorescence that we studied. And then they have a big increase of MPQ, which is the extra like energy the vegetation cannot deal with in these two pathways. So they're going to use the third pathway so that they are not going to get destroyed. But our actually, the final results showing is this black was photosynthesis pathway, but then those fluorescence pathway and this MPQ pathway was both significant increase. So those both significant increase actually make this back to this GBP and safe data was not really matched well. So this when you during stress situation, safe is really difficult to capture the GBP. That's the reason. Okay, so this is just a takeaway, just thinking about how we using safe data to capture dryland photosynthesis. But then I think we could be cautious to use those data in low productivity sites. But you could using the combination of NRV or NRVP, which is the two greenness index. They are really good at the low productivity sites. And then the second is we should be cautious when the vegetation is stress conditions. But also you could use combinations of PRI because the PRI indices actually could indicate the vegetation during stress, and those might change how safe actually capture GBP. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You know, it's technically lunchtime, but I was wondering, is there one or two questions for our last speaker? We have a microphone that can roam around the room. Actually, I have a question, and it has to do with like the mechanism. Could you say just a few words about what it is that causes the plants to fluoresce? I mean, that might be kind of dumb, but I just wonder, like, what is it that does that?
I don't think it's dumb questions. Actually, at the beginning, I was studying about that. I don't know that either. I think a lot of materials actually fluorescence. So vegetation, when they're doing photosynthesis, they're absorbing the light and the photons. So when the photons change energies, it automatically releases the fluorescence. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thanks. So I'd really like to thank all of you for coming and all the people online. And of course, our three speakers. I think those were great talks. I really enjoyed this session. We went a little long, but hey, that's how it is. And it was really good, and I'm really and also thank you very much. Cassandra really put this together. She's actually the one that did it. So extremely grateful.